As Europeans fanned out across the globe, they encountered various peoples and civilizations who differed from their civilization, both in terms of physical appearance, in terms of culture, and societies. To account for these differences, the Europeans fell back upon the medieval concept of the Great Chain of Being, which posited that God had organized the universe in a particular way with a hierarchy of creatures and beings emanating from God downward down to the lowest level. If this were true, then within the subset of humankind, there might also be a God-granted hierarchical organization of people from superior civilizations to less superior or even inferior civilizations. This also tended to rationalize and justify the simultaneous concept of Europeans at the time of exploiting Africa for the African slave trade to acquire the manual labor that was necessary to exploit the physical resources of the colonies of the New World. It was in the Americas that European civilization encountered and came into contact with indigenous civilizations, the Native Americans. And in that case, there was a frontier that was established between what the Europeans considered to be the civilized world and the uncivilized world. Depending upon the nature of the encounter between European civilization and the Native American civilization, the views of the natives varied between a noble savage, which became a literary stock character that embodied the concept of the indigenous outsider, a wild human being, and an other, who was not yet corrupted by civilization and therefore symbolized humanity's innate goodness, or something else. There were those Europeans who viewed the Native Americans as absolutely barbaric and savage, capable of cannibalism and also cruelty in their encounter with the white European civilization. The encounter on the frontier was often frequently and violent, as the Native Americans tended to resist the incursions of Europeans, and as the Europeans claimed that they had a superior right to grow and expand into Native American territory as a result of their superior civilization. So a series of frontier wars began from the 1600s and lasted all the way up until the late 1800s. The early and continuing solution to the problem of the coexistence of European civilization and Native American civilization inhabiting the same spaces was to create the concept of the Indian reservation, which was originally created by British North American colonists in the 1600s and continued all the way up to this day by Americans. The concept of the reservation was to set aside space and to create a place where Indians could fully be Indians, practice their civilization and follow their own morals and their own behaviors and have even their own law. And that was a place where all that could happen. Anywhere else, they'd have to follow the mores, rules, and the laws of white and or European civilization. So as you could see by the previous slide, that the advancing frontier of American civilization spreading across the continent pushed the Indians further and further west and into smaller and smaller designated spaces. The concept of the frontier was seized upon by American historian Frederick Jackson Turner as he saw the frontier as the key element in what transformed Europeans into Americans and created the building blocks of the unique form of American democracy. This concept of the frontier was noticed and seized upon by Lord Curzon, one of the preeminent British imperialists of the 19th century. And in a lecture in 1907, he pointed out that not till the mountains were left behind and the American pioneers began to push across the trackless plains did America cease to be English and become America. He also noticed that similar things were happening with regards to the British frontiers and how the frontier was affecting British civilization. He said British Empire may be seen shaping the British character while the British character is still building the British Empire. There too, on the manifold frontiers of Dominion, now and amid the gaunt highlands of the Indian border or the eternal snows of the Himalayas, now on the parched sands of Persia or Arabia, now in the equatorial swamps and forests of Africa, and in the incessant struggle with nature and man, has been found a corresponding discipline for the men of our stock. Outside of the English universities, no school of character exists to compare with the frontier, and character is there molded not by attrition with fellow men in the arts of studies and of peace, but in the furnace of responsibility on the anvil of self-reliance. Of course, it was in the 19th century that Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution to try to explain the origin of all species on the planet and how they encountered each other in the space of nature. Charles Darwin used the phrase struggle for existence in a broad sense to identify the competition for resources to live, and therefore was one of the engines of his concept of evolution. Later, T.H. Huxley further developed the idea of the struggle for existence. Huxley did not fully agree with Darwin on natural selection, but he did agree that there was a struggle for existence in nature. So nature was the space and the place where all life came into contact with all other life and struggled against each other in order to find a niche for itself. In our next lesson, we'll talk about how the space of wilderness became frontier and how the space of frontier became managed space in terms of our contemporary world. Thank you very much for your kind attentions. Please use your hearts and minds for good and useful purposes, and I look forward to you being part of the next lessons.